Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. My name is Eric Trexler. I am the special temporary primary host. For today's episode, I'm going to be joined by Greg Nuckols. He is currently the permanent guest co-host for the time being. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
How are you doing?
You know what? I'll be completely honest with you and the listeners.
This is why I stopped asking.
I'm not doing my best today. Yesterday, my wife and I got both our COVID booster and our flu shot for the year. The thinking behind that was historically they've had very different effects on me. So COVID booster makes me feel kind of achy, sluggish, tired, and flu shots. I don't think this is a common thing, but for whatever reason, flu shots just make me feel extremely wired, as if they're like a super powerful stimulant, I guess, like just limitless amounts of nervous energy, which I guess is just like my immune system just kind of like picking up my sympathetic nervous system to be like, like it's time to fight something, whatever. So very different historical effects of those two vaccines. So I was thinking like, well, if I just knock them out on the same day, maybe it'll just like more or less cancel each other out, you know?
Take an upper and a downer.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Instead, it turned out to be the worst of both worlds. Very sluggish, very achy. Felt like I got hit by a truck, but then also like couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
So I feel like I got run over by a truck today, and I am not at my best. But I will try to pull things together and make for at least a tolerable episode for both you and the audience.
Over under of comments we get about COVID and vaccines.
Well,
where are we setting the betting line?
It's going to be a lower number than it was initially going to be. I had just a lot of jokes and bits planned about that, but as I understand it, certain podcast platforms are very sensitive about that kind of stuff and don't do a good job of telling apart sarcastic jokes from sincerely held beliefs. So, yeah. So I think, I don't know. I think we'll probably get, I'd put the over under at like 12, maybe.
Yeah. I think I will take the under.
Okay.
If we're saying discrete comments and not including follow-ups. I'll take the under on that.
Do you read the YouTube comments?
I don't.
Okay. Well, in this case, I'm like the house. I'm like the Vegas casino that has access to maybe a little bit more inside information than all of the bettors do, and we will see.
All right, yeah, time will tell.
How are you doing today?
I'm good.
Good.
Yeah, no complaints. Let's get into it here.
Let's do it.
If you like the show, I have no way of knowing because I don't read the YouTube comments. But if you like it, there are ways that you could support it. You could like, rate, or subscribe wherever you happen to get the podcast. As I mentioned last week, you could sign up for the email newsletter. We send out weekly emails with really useful research updates. And to find out more about that or sign up for free, you can go to strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. If you're looking for a one-on-one coach who works in a virtual capacity, looking for some online coaching, we do offer that. We have a very talented and experienced team of coaches. You can learn more about that at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you are looking for a little discount on your supplements, or I should probably say a massive discount on your supplements, go to bulksupplements.com. You can use our code SBSPOD, SBSPOD. That will get you a 5% discount off your entire order. And of course, if you want to support us further, you could check out the Mass Research Review, which we publish every single month, the first of the month, reviewing all the newest research in exercise and nutrition, and some miscellaneous topics. I've been doing a little stuff on psychology and coaching and things like that. And you could also check out Macro Factor. That's the diet app that we co-developed with a very talented team of developers. And we do have a free trial, so you can give it a shot, take it for a spin, and see if you like it before you commit financially. Now, before we get into our prepared segments, a little bit of chatter here. On the show in the past, we've talked a little bit about academic publishing or scientific publishing. I would say in some cases we've been critical of the process, and there's a new kind of publication model. It seems new to me. I haven't seen any like major high profile journals try this yet, but it was just announced like a day or two ago. And so my Twitter, which is carefully cultivated, everybody's talking about it in my Twitter timeline. So a journal called eLife is really changing the way they do it. So normally, you'll submit a paper to a journal and the editor will take a look at it. And if the editor is like, hey, this is just crap, they'll just send it back and say like, hey, I'm not going to send that out to peer reviewers. Or if they simply decide, you know what, I think this is good work, but it just doesn't really make sense in our journal. It's just way too off topic for what we focus on. So great work, but you might want to take it elsewhere. Again, it'll just go straight back to the author. The editor makes the first choice of saying, okay, this is good enough and it's a decent fit for our journal. I'm going to seek out peer reviewers who are going to critique it, weigh in, and then ultimately the peer reviewers give a recommendation to the editor. Something that's kind of interesting is theoretically, there's nothing stopping an editor if he or she sends it out to multiple reviewers and all the reviewers say, this sucks. This is the dumbest thing I've ever read. It's fabricated, fraudulent. This is just absolutely terrible work in every possible way. Technically, the editor still makes the call and can just say like, I liked it.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the editor takes the recommendations from the reviewers very seriously. And in most cases, if the reviewers can't really come to a consensus, then the editor tries to reach a consensus and ultimately make a judgment that is compatible with the reviews. And the editor decides either we're going to accept this paper and publish it or reject it, hand it back to the author and say, do whatever you want with it. So this new model, the spin that they're taking here is the editor is still going to do that first line of kind of editorial judgment where they say, okay, yeah, this looks pretty good enough for a review, and I think it kind of works for our journal. Once they decide to send it to reviewers, eLife is now committed to publishing that paper, but they are not making any decisions about accepting or rejecting the paper. So basically what they're going to do is publish the paper with a lot of transparency about what the reviewers thought about it. So theoretically, they could be hosting a paper that is technically published on their site that is just absolutely dreadful, and all the reviews are quite negative. So what they're doing is they're turning it away from a dichotomous decision of this is excellent, perfect science or not excellent, perfect science. And they're making it more of a type of thing where it's like, here's an article, here's what some reviewers think, and it's a little bit more fluid, a little bit more, there's more gradation there in terms of each individual research or whoever's reading it kind of making an assessment of, all right, how good was this? And what do some content experts think about it? So it's really an interesting idea, and I think it's really cool, and I'm pretty on board with that. I don't think it's like a silver bullet. I don't think it's the perfect thing that's going to revolutionize publishing for the better. But I'm generally interested in breaking up the inertia in the academic publishing infrastructure and process. I'm interested in more avenues to publication that are dramatically different from the status quo, because I think if we try a few different iterations, at the very least, we'll get out of this really rigid kind of single approach to publishing. So I think it's really cool. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of good takes about this on the internet and a lot of bad takes about it, in my opinion. One of the things that's really interesting is there seems to be a misconception about why editors offloaded a lot of the decision making to reviewers in the first place. There seems to be a misunderstanding of the historical evolution of that process. So I saw somebody posted, I'm going to link to this in the show notes, but it was kind of a historical look at how this came to be. And much to my surprise, I genuinely didn't know this. For a long time there, up until like the 60s and 70s, It pretty much was just that the editors called the shots, and a lot of the reviewing process was handled in-house by the journal.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just like fishing it around and like emailing people like, hey, I need to go, track down 2 or 3 folks to review this. Where's my list of reviewers? It was very much the journal made editorial decisions in-house and didn't rely on external peer reviews. If they did, it was not as commonplace as it is today. But according to the thing I'm linking in the show notes here, it says that basically the journals just said like, hey, this is kind of a lot. Like, we're just kind of struggling to keep up with this. We need to lighten our workload on the editorial side, and doing all of this ourselves is very cumbersome. Mm-hmm. And so they also said that, this is not what they call pleasant or satisfying work. They're like, we just don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And so the bad take that I've been seeing is this assumption that the way the peer review process currently works was established because it safeguards quality and was made for, the decision-making process was just driven by, we need to make sure that we have the most rigorous processes in place, and this ensures the highest degree of rigor. And if we bypass this typical process, there's no way that we could possibly safeguard the quality of the peer-reviewed literature or the scientific literature. And
I mean, one thing I'll note is there's an assumption that I think most people very reasonably make, which is, since this is about scientific publishing, after all, if the publication model changes and the mechanism by which papers are accepted or rejected from the journals changes, I think it's a perfectly reasonable assumption to just assume that some scientists did some science and made sure that the new system worked better than the old system. But that simply didn't happen. They just moved to a peer review focused system for a variety of other reasons.
Right. And there was also a former editor-in-chief, was it the British Journal of Medicine?
Yeah, it was BMJ. I think the title of the paper was Peer Review, a Flawed Process at the Heart of Science and Journals. I can find it real quick.
Yeah, but there was basically, it sounds kind of silly when you put it this way, but the peer-reviewed literature suggests that peer review is pretty not great. It does not live up to the kind of agreed upon expectations in terms of quality and rigor. And yeah, like peer-reviewed research has been carried out to see how good is peer review, and it doesn't really provide the level of quality control that a lot of people are indicating in this conversation.
Yeah.
And by the way, just to give credit where credit's due, the thing I linked in the show notes that was talking about the historical context of this process, it was called, it's a journal article called Scientific Autonomy, Public Accountability, and the Rise of Peer Review in the Cold War United States by Melinda Baldwin.
Yes, I have not read that article yet. I'm going to put something else in the show notes to be linked.
Sure.
It's an article from 2018 on... It's an interview on just more of a non-academic, but therefore like more readable platform from a guy named Robert Harrington, which is also a pretty good history of peer review. I will note, I'm a little bit offended that you noted that you weren't aware of some of the history of peer review prior to this, because I think I did a segment on the podcast about it before.
Well,
but
I was not aware of the explicit admission from journals that they started outsourcing reviews simply because they didn't feel like doing it anymore.
No, that's fair. One of the other big factors, at least in the US, and so one of the things that's kind of like almost universally accepted is just that peer review is a very good system, which, like I said, the research, or like you said, the research tends to suggest that it's not that good of a system. So then the question is like, how did we get it in our ideas, or like how did we get it in our heads in the first place that it did work really, really well? And it seems to mostly be like a marketing campaign by scientists, which is very impressive, because I would just assume most scientists aren't great at marketing. But like one of the steps along that history was in the U.S. during the recession in the 70s, like during the stagflation era. People in Congress and the Senate started reviewing projects that the NSF, the National Science Foundation, was funding. And you still see this discourse today. Like, they'll look and see some of the projects getting funded and be like, like, this is frivolous, this is a waste of taxpayer dollars, et cetera, et cetera. We need to cut funding to the NSF, or in the case of the 70s, bring more of that funding under congressional oversight to make sure that, since it was during the Cold War, it was like, we need to make sure that the NSF is funding projects that can help us, like, blow up the Ruskies if it comes to that. Like, that was kind of the vibe. And the NSF was like, fuck that. Like, we don't want politicians, like, meddling in our funding. Like, we are scientists. We understand the needs of the fields we cover better than they do. And so that's when they shifted to a peer review model, not for publication, but for grant funding, to basically say, like, look, you want more eyes on the funding that the NSF gives out, but, like, we think other scientists in this field will understand that better than just, like, random senators from, random states that don't know anything about science. And so they sold that to Congress just as a way to get less congressional oversight. And so in doing so, they had to sell the process of peer review for funding as, like, this is this really good thing that we know works really well and will definitely work better than this, like, alternate system you're proposing. And then from there, it kind of, like, trickled down further into actual publication. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of practical takeaways from this, for people who are listening along, I think there's a couple things that come to mind. One is that as people start exploring these alternative publishing models, like just throwing something up on a preprint server, or doing this, which is basically a preprint with comments from specifically selected reviewers. Mm-hmm. So when you start seeing these types of papers, you can't really assume, like, oh, this has been peer reviewed and therefore it's correct. Counterpoint, you probably never should have assumed that in the first place.
Yes, and I think that if that instills a little more doubt in people, that's ultimately a good thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I saw a lot of chatter that was saying, well, how can we just blindly assume that all these papers are rigorous and very good? And I was like, were you doing that previously? Like, why? Like, you're acting as, so people were like, oh, well, these guys, people are just going to publish papers here so they can have a link and a DOI and say, look at this research I published. All my wacky ideas are actually science. And that would make sense if it literally didn't already happen. But
exactly,
it absolutely already happens within the normal peer review process.
I mean, if anything, I think this is preferable, because the way it would work now, if you were trying to get dodgy research published, is you might try to slip it into a good journal in the first place. They send it out for peer review. Maybe the peer reviewers do a good job. Maybe you just get desk rejected, and ultimately the paper gets rejected and you just need to move on to some other journal. But the thing is, there are so many journals, and like, there are enough scammy journals that are basically just pay to play, that you will be able to get that paper published somewhere. And generally, like, reviewer comments in most journals aren't open yet. So as it is, like, it takes a little bit more effort to get dodgy stuff published, but you absolutely can still get it published. And then, it's sitting there in PubMed without any pushback. With this model, if you're trying to get something dodgy published, well, cool. Like, it gets published right off the bat, and there are reviewer letters attached to it saying, like, well, this is published, but it's kind of bullshit,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there is, like, within kind of that document itself, there's pushback that wouldn't exist otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that this removes the automatic credibility of a paper being published, and I struggle to see that as a bad thing.
Yeah, I am all for that.
All right, so moving on, Greg, you have some hard-hitting science to share as well.
I do. No, this was just kind of a shit post. A rugby strength coach on Twitter tweeted a scatter plot showing the relationship between bench press 1 rep max and number of self-reported sexual partners. I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe I recognize this data set. I think this was a survey from the R bodybuilding subreddit back in 2018, but don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. But yeah, no, the funny part about it was just that there was one person with, so most of the bench presses were about what you'd expect, somewhere from the like low to mid hundreds in terms of pounds up to like 300, 350, the normal weights that people bench press. And within that range, it didn't seem like there was really any relationship at all between self-reported bench press max and self-reported number of sexual partners. But the funny thing was, there was one individual who bench pressed more than 100 pounds more than anyone else. They benched 450, and the next highest, 550. Yeah. They bench pressed 550, and the next highest was looks like 430 maybe. Anyway, that person reported no sexual partners, which is just inherently funny. I think that's a guy who's really dedicated to his craft.
I think it's funny just because it almost it's like, what if an Excel figure was actually an advertisement for Animal Pack?
Yeah.
Of just the
oh my God. Yes.
Just like in a dungeon and being like, oh, I'm so focused on this bench press that, it's the only thing in my mind right now. But to be clear, we're not trying to reinforce any narratives that it's good or bad to have a high or low number of sexual partners or anything like that. But this kind of tweet definitely fuels plenty of jokes, because there's kind of a running joke and a running stereotype that a lot of young guys get into lifting and they're really excited about how it's going to have this huge impact on their dating life. And it doesn't always go that way.
Absolutely. I think that doing a shitpost review segment of the podcast might be a new low for us, but I'm honestly completely fine with it.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of a new low, we've got a couple great segments today, but before we do that, we need to shamelessly sell out. So we're going to take a quick timeout for an obscene profit break. As the first and only fitness podcast with a steadfast commitment to traditional family values, we know that protecting families is important.
Right you are, Eric, but I will note there are some things that are even more important than protecting traditional family values and the moral fabric of our society.
That's right, Greg. It's important to protect families, but it's even more important to protect corporate entities.
I could not agree more. The U.S. Supreme Court knows that corporations are people, and the team at Stronger by Science, LLC, knows that corporations are some of the most important people around.
That's why I joined the advisory board for the Sports Nutrition Association, along with trusted fitness pros like Danny Lennon and distrusted arch nemesis like Eric Helms.
That's good thinking, Eric. You got to keep your friends close and enemies closer.
Absolutely. The Sports Nutrition Association is the home of sports nutrition. They are dedicated to ensuring the sustainable prosperity of the sports nutrition profession, and they offer a unique pathway to robust insurance coverage for your sports nutrition business. Simply put, it's the best way to protect the corporate entities that are closest to your heart.
And I should note, if you're an individual sole proprietor providing sports nutrition services and not a corporate entity, the Sports Nutrition Association can help you out as well.
That is correct. All insurance plans are handled individually on a case-by-case basis, regardless of how your sports nutrition business is structured. But even if you don't want insurance coverage, SNA membership comes with a bunch of other perks and advantages. The Sports Nutrition Association is the only global professional sports body that has a defined standard for sports nutrition scope of practice for its members. This ensures that members maintain high standards in their practice so that the public can always trust in the quality associated with the services of an accredited sports nutritionist through the Sports Nutrition Association. If you already meet their minimum education requirements, you can become an accredited sports nutritionist with the Sports Nutrition Association today. If you don't meet those education requirements yet, you can enroll in the certificate program in applied sports nutrition. That allows you to become a provisionally accredited member upon completion. To learn more about the Sports Nutrition Association, head over to www.sportsnutritionassociation.com today. Today's episode is sponsored by the Sports Nutrition Association, and Stronger by Science LLC sincerely appreciates their support. All right, so Greg, your segment today, what do you have for us?
So I am talking about partial range of motion training, specifically for strength. So I partnered with Milo Wolf, who recently pre-printed a meta-analysis examining the research looking at the impact of range of motion on strength development, muscle growth, etc. And we have a very in-depth article that is going to drop on November 1st. I believe this episode is going to be published in full on the 31st. So if you are listening to the full episode and not one of the clips that gets posted on YouTube beforehand, that article will be up tomorrow. But I think most of the current interest around this topic is related to the impact of longer versus shorter ranges of motion and training at longer versus shorter muscle lengths on hypertrophy. But there is some pretty interesting research looking at the effect of partial range of motion training per se, but more importantly, combining partial and full range of motion training for improving full range of motion strength gains. So that is what this segment is going to be talking about. So Eric, have you ever experimented much with partial range of motion training, things like rack pulls, board press, etc.?
Yeah, for sure.
What's your current vibe around those training practices, and what's your experience?
Well, back in the day, a great way to make my bench press seem higher was to simply not go as low.
Nice.
So that was my first venture into limited range of motion training. My perspective has been poisoned because I've read all of the mass articles as a reviewer of mass. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of up to speed with what the research shows, but I know, for me, when I was, back in the day before looking into all the literature, I would use partial range of motion stuff for a variety of different reasons. I mean, sometimes it's very intuitive, right? So I used to do various bench press variations, and you could tell when you'd get that stretch at the bottom of the rep, you could really feel your pecs stretching out. I mean, I would crank half repetitions in that lengthened position like crazy, and just, you feel the burn and the pump and all that stuff. So even before looking at the research, it was very clear to me, there is something different here to some extent about altering range of motion. So I think partials on bench on both sides of the spectrum are really the biggest thing that I would do.
Nice, cool. Yeah, I'm in a similar boat. Used to do a lot of pin press. Used to do a lot of board press. Also, really enjoy block pulls. Used to do a ton of rack pulls until I basically just got strong enough that it would bend bars. Rack pulls are very, very rough on bars. That's not an I'm very strong statement. That is if you do rack pulls with a fair bit of weight, that's very rough on bars statement. But yeah, I like partials. I think they're fun. But I think that they have fallen out of favor in a lot of circles these days. I think that people became, generally acquainted with the principle of specificity, the idea that, hey, if I want to get strong through a full range of motion, I should train through a full range of motion, and especially overload type partials. So things like board press or pin press or block pulls or half squats. They've been, I think, in the general consciousness of the lifting community, kind of consigned to the bin of ego lifting. Where maybe if you're doing equipped lifting, where lockout strength might be a really big concern, maybe they have a role. But especially if you're trying to do raw lifting, I just don't see as much partial range of motion training as I used to. It really seems to have fallen out of favor. But partial range of motion training through short muscle lengths, so overload partials, do have a long and illustrious history in the strength community. So two of the great pioneers, at least of like the American strength training tradition, built some pretty legendary lifts on the backs of a lot of partials. So one was Bob Peoples, who I believe is the first person to ever deadlift over 700 pounds. His best deadlift was 728 at 181, which he pulled in 1946, I believe, which if he did it today would still be the 12th best deadlift all time in the 181 class for like drug tested federations. And which, I mean, like, I don't think steroids had reached the backwoods of Tennessee, which is where Bob Peoples was from in 1946. But even if you're like, like he somehow had the gear hookup a year after World War II, like that pull would still be top 50 at 181, even counting untested fed. So like just leaps and bounds ahead of the competition back in the 40s. He did a lot of, you know, what we would know today as rack pulls to build his deadlift. A lot of deadlifts from just below knee height, just above knee height, in order to build his lockout strength. And then another very famous example is Paul Anderson, who built his legendary, and I use that term with all of the assumed connotations. Legendary both in terms of it was doubtlessly a very impressive squat, but legendary also in the term of it may have been a legend and his squat wasn't as good as people have claimed. But yeah, like an incredible squatter who it is claimed that he potentially squatted 1,200 pounds, which I don't know how much I buy that, but also when you see pictures of the guy, he looks like the type of guy who might have been able to squat 1,200 pounds. Hard to say, but he was famous for, like, one of his squat training methods is he would dig a hole and basically just have like a squat bar on the ground and get down into the hole and just do partial reps. And then once he could do, I think, like 8 to 10 reps at a certain height, he would just put some dirt in the hole. So now the hole is not quite as deep and the range of motion is a little bit longer, and, you know, do partial squats that way as well. So if you've ever heard of people referring to bottom up pin squats as Anderson squats, that's why. But just very cool, very innovative. You know, you don't have a squat rack, you can just dig a hole. Very cool stuff. Also, just as an aside, Paul Anderson did all sorts of just like very fun sounding training back in the day. One story, and this is a little bit far afield, but it's a nice story that I think people should know. So he was most famous, I think, for just really, really incredible squat strength and really, really incredible overhead press strength. And one of the things he used to do is he had a farm, he had a lot of land, and he just enjoyed golf, like as an amateur golfer. I don't think he was particularly good, but I imagine it was a situation where he could slap a drive a mile. And he would set up a squat rack on either end of his big field and load like 800 pounds on one of the bars and like 400 pounds on the other bar, and just go out there with his driver, a golf ball, and like a gallon of milk, and start on the squat rack with 800 pounds, do a couple reps of squats, smack the ball across the field, sipping on his milk as he went.
And this was in Tennessee?
No. Bob Peoples was from Tennessee. Paul Anderson was from somewhere in the South, I think Georgia, but don't quote me on that.
Okay, because when you said milk, my first thought was the old Anchorman. Milk was a bad choice. I just think of being like 98 degrees, squatting 800 gallon of milk. Not good. I
guess he was just built different.
Yeah.
Anyway, smack the ball to the other end of the field, do like 2 or 3 reps of shoulder press with the 400 pound bar, and then just smack the ball back. So, you know, getting some steps in, getting some low intensity cardio, and just making a day of doing squats and overhead press. Very, very cool. Anyway, so yeah, there's a proud history of partials in the strength training tradition. And one thing I'll note is the story of Paul Anderson allegedly squatting 1,200 pounds is far more interesting than I realized. I found a really cool article on Breaking Muscle that will be linked in the show notes. Essentially just breaking down how plausible it was for it to have potentially happened. Like, essentially the apparatus used for his alleged 1,200 pound squat, could it have actually held 1,200 pounds? Like what were the incentives around this? Because essentially it was a show where he was performing in a casino in Reno, Nevada, and instead of just like a squat bar, it was two big metal and glass boxes that were allegedly loaded with like 15,000 silver dollars. So 7,500 in one box, 7,500 in the other box. And that, in combination with the weight of the apparatus itself, was allegedly, depending who you ask, either 1,160 pounds or 1,200 pounds. And he would apparently go and squat it for a crowd with kind of the old time circus strongman gambit of, if anyone else in the audience can do this, you can have the $1,500, which this was, I think, in the 50s. So that was a ton of money back then. And so, the article gets into, well, it probably wasn't actually 1,200 pounds, but there were other strong people back then. And so there was incentive for it to be very, very heavy, because if it wasn't, and someone else claimed that money, the casino's out of $15,000. And also, like, the fact that it was silver dollars is important, because this intersected with debates in the US at the time about, should we move to the silver standard versus the gold standard, or like paper money, all of that, like Williams, Jennings Bryan stuff. And the folks who ran this casino in Nevada were very into the idea of a silver standard, which you just don't see that many overlaps between powerlifting and monetary policy. So, very cool story. Anyway, intro out of the way, let's actually get into the research on the topic. So, in general, I think we all kind of know and acknowledge this. For the most part, if you had to pick one training modality, like if you had to pick one type of range of motion to train through, and you wanted to build strength through a full range of motion, you should do full range of motion training. That is not particularly controversial. That's strongly empirically supported. In Milo's meta-analysis, that was one of the things they looked at. And for tests of full range of motion strength, full range of motion training works better than partial range of motion training. Like, that's not controversial at all. However, most people who would be doing some partial range of motion training are also still going to be doing full range of motion training as well. Like, if you're a power lifter and you want to do some block pulls, you'll probably still be doing deadlifts from the floor. If you want to do some board press, you'll probably still be doing plenty of bench press to your chest. So I think the more interesting and relevant question is, what does the research have to say about combining different ranges of motion instead of just doing full range of motion training versus just doing partial range of motion training? Because, in science, we like to be able to create clear dichotomies, isolate variables, and just say, okay, full range versus partial range, what are the differences? But at least for ecological validity, to better reflect how people train in the real world, I think the research looking at a combination of different ranges of motion is just a lot more informative about what you could expect using the methods that people would actually use in real training. So let's dive in. There are 4 relevant studies that I'm going to discuss here briefly. The first one was by Bazyler and colleagues from 2014. All of the studies I mentioned will be in the show notes. And so in this study, one group, so there were 2 groups of subjects. One group just trained squats through a full range of motion, doing 6 sets twice per week. And the other group also trained squats twice per week, doing 3 sets through a full range of motion and 3 sets of partial squats, so through about 80 degrees of knee flexion, or roughly half squats. So the total number of sets were equated, but one group just did all full squats. The other group did 50-50 full squats and half squats. It was a 7-week training intervention. And long story short, there weren't statistically significant differences between groups, but the nominal differences did lean in favor of the group doing a combination of full and partial range of motion training. So their 1 rep max full squat increased by about 8.2% on average versus 5.1% in the group only doing full squats. And also the group doing a combination of full and partial squats experienced nominally larger gains in partial squat 1 rep max as well, though that is not particularly surprising. Moving on, the second study was by Gillingham and Debeliso. And I'll note, the Gillingham in this study is Brad Gillingham, which, if you're into powerlifting at all, I assume you know who Brad Gillingham is, and if you don't, shame on you. He is an absolute legend. He won 6 world championships in powerlifting, and I believe he has still, to this day, pulled more than 800 pounds in competition, more discrete times than any other human. Just a legendary deadlifter. And his best deadlift was 400 kilos in the super heavyweight class. So it's very cool to see him getting into the lab, getting his hands dirty. And I'll note, if you're listening to this and you ever encounter the perspective of someone online being like, exercise science researchers, they don't know anything about real strength training. I mean, here's an anecdote that at least one of them does. Brad Gillingham, absolute legend in powerlifting. So in this group, in this study, it was a 6-week training study in a group of collegiate wrestlers undergoing their preseason training program. And one group just did full range of motion deadlifts. The other group subbed out one of those sets of full range of motion deadlifts for 3 singles through a partial range of motion from just above the kneecap. So the total number of sets weren't equated between groups, but the group doing only full range of motion training, it was like it was sets that looked like pretty challenging sets of 5. And the singles for the block pulls that they did, or rack pulls, weren't with like super max loads, not like 150% of 1RM. As someone who's done a lot of deadlift training, the total stress that the two groups underwent, I think, was more or less equivalent. Just that is my personal belief. But yeah, so they trained for 6 weeks. The group only doing full range of motion training actually experienced a small non-significant decrease in strength of about 5.3 kilos on their full range of motion deadlift, whereas the group doing a combination of full and partial range of motion training experienced a small increase in deadlift strength of about 4.5 kilos. So again, much like the Bazyler study, that didn't amount to a statistically significant difference between groups, but the nominal difference did lean in favor of doing a combination of full and partial range of motion training instead of just full range of motion. And then once again, very unsurprisingly, the group doing some partial range of motion training also experienced significantly larger gains in rack pull strength. So they tested one rep max for rack pulls as well. Moving on, third study was by Pedrosa and colleagues. This one, I believe, was published in 2021. And it's not exactly the same as the prior study. So the prior 2 studies compared full range of motion training versus a combination of full and partial range of motion training. This one compared full range of motion training to a combination of 2 different partial ranges of motion. So one group did knee extensions through a full range of motion. The other group did half of their sets through a partial range of motion through the bottom half of the lift, and half of their sets through a partial range of motion through the top half of the lift. So a combination of 2 different partial ranges of motion. Overall, this one was very similar. They trained for 12 weeks. There were overall 5 groups in this study. So if you're watching on YouTube, when we throw up the figure from the study, you will see 5 bars. But the 2 that are relevant for this discussion here will have a red box around them. So they tested strength gains in this study through the bottom half of the range of motion. So partial range of motion strength through the bottom half, partial range of motion strength through the top half, and also full range of motion strength gains through the full range of motion. And in all cases, the combination of those 2 partial ranges of motion produced larger strength gains than just training through a full range of motion. Again, even when equating total sets. And the difference was statistically significant for strength gains through the bottom half of the range of motion, but for full range of motion strength gains, as we saw in the Bazyler study and the Gillingham study, nominal differences in favor of the partials, but it wasn't a statistically significant difference. And then finally, the last of these 4 studies, 2020 paper by Whaley and colleagues. And this one was slightly different again. Instead of, so the other 3 studies, essentially you'd have one group doing full range of motion training and the other groups basically doing half of their training through a full range of motion or through the bottom half of the range of motion and half of their training through a partial range of motion at short muscle lengths. And you know, like 50-50 per session, per week, whatever. In the Whaley study, they used progressive range of motion training, much like Paul Anderson filling in that hole for his progressive range of motion squats. This was a 7-week training study. There was one group squatting through a full range of motion every session and another group doing progressive range of motion training. So they were doing pin squats, basically starting from like a quarter squat height with the pins getting lower and lower and lower each workout, such that by week 7, it was basically doing pin squats through effectively a full range of motion. And once again, just like the other 3 studies, they tested full range of motion squat 1 rep max, and there wasn't a statistically significant difference between groups, but the nominal differences once again leaned in favor of the group doing a combination of full and partial range of motion training. In this case, it was progressive range of motion training. So that group experienced a 14.5 kilo increase in squat 1 rep max on average versus 11 kilos for the group only doing full range of motion training. And also in this study, they looked at gains in vertical jump height, which were also nominally larger in the group doing progressive range of motion training. So when you look at these 4 studies in aggregate, you know, it's a bit of a Rorschach test, I would say. If you wanted to interpret them very, very conservatively, you could say, hey, scientists have had 4 bites at the apple this time and have thus far failed to demonstrate statistically significant differences between these 2 training styles. Or you could interpret it a little more liberally and say, well, look, you know, the concept of statistical significance is kind of arbitrary in the first place. You know, is P of 0.07 really that different from P of 0.03? And ultimately, we have 4 relatively similar studies finding very similar results. So, you know, maybe there's something to it. And ultimately, I'm still skeptical but bullish, I would say. Like, I would want to see another couple of studies. I think if we got 2 more studies that also showed kind of nominal differences in favor of the combination, even if they weren't statistically significant, or just one more study where there was like a pretty big statistically significant, very notable difference between the 2 approaches, I'd be like, yeah, like at this point we can probably cash this in, put a pretty substantial number of eggs in that basket. But yeah, it's to me right now kind of right on that knife's edge of how seriously we should take this. But the balance of evidence to this point does broadly suggest that a combination of full and partial range of motion training probably on average produces slightly larger strength gains than exclusively training through a full range of motion. Then the next obvious question is, well, why would that be? And to be honest, I'm not sure. It could simply be a matter of variety. So there was a 2014 paper by Fonseca and colleagues to kind of use as an object lesson here, where there were 2 groups in that study that only did squats, and 2 groups in that study that did squats and also a variety of other lower body exercises. But, you know, like for example, the 2 groups just doing squats, I think wound up doing like 8 sets of squats per workout, and the groups doing a variety of exercises would do 2 sets of squats, 2 sets, I think, of deadlifts, 2 sets of lunges or something like that, maybe 2 sets of essentially like sissy squat, something like that. I forget all of the details, but that was the basic setup. And the groups doing a variety of different exercises in that study gained more squat strength than the groups just doing squats, which suggests that, like you certainly need specificity to gain strength, but there might just be some inherent benefit to having some variety and not being hyper specific all the time. So, in this case, that could be all we're seeing. Maybe partial range of motion training isn't like super beneficial per se, but just like subbing out a third or a half of your full range of motion training. Like if you're doing 20 sets of full range of motion squats, maybe like competition style, maybe subbing out 10 of those sets for half squats or pin squats or pause squats or box squats or band squats, or just like basically anything else. Like we could just be seeing an effect that is attributable to variety rather than partial range of motion training per se. I think this is somewhat dubious, but I think I would get called out for it if I didn't at least mention it. One kind of like historical reason that people have cited in the past for why like overload style partials, short muscle length partials that you can just load heavier than full range of motion training. One reason people have proposed that those might be beneficial is that they could have like outsized effects on connective tissue strength or bone strength, which, downstream of that might result in larger strength gains. To my knowledge, there's not much, if any, direct evidence for this. And the research we do have looking at like changes in tendon strength with training tends to suggest that load actually isn't all that important. Like resistance training is good, but as long as it's like a reasonably challenging load, it seems to have like pretty comparable effects on gains in tendon strength. So I'm pretty skeptical about that, but that is a potential mechanism that hasn't been directly investigated, so can't fully rule it out. And then another possibility is that it could be mostly psychological, where especially for 1 rep max testing, and especially for people who aren't that experienced with 1 rep max testing, there's kind of the oh shit factor. Like if you're attempting a new 1 rep max bench, attempting a new 1 rep max squat, as soon as you unrack that weight and feel it in your hands or on your shoulders, maybe you're capable of it, but Jesus Christ, it's just fucking scary, if you've never touched anything that heavy before. So, it could be that overload partials just help on that front, just get you used to feeling more weight so that maybe they don't actually make you that much stronger, but they kind of help you psychologically be able to lift the weights you are actually capable of lifting without just kind of shutting down and locking up when you feel those really heavy 1 rep max attempts.
It'd be really cool if someone were to do a study where they did, like, for example, if they were looking at squats and had had one of the groups just doing walkouts to try to kind of be like, hey, just so you know, here's what this really heavy stuff feels like. Yeah. Like there would be a way experimentally to get at that, but I mean, I assume no one's done that.
I don't believe they have.
Yeah.
But I will note, I don't think that this potential explanation explains all of these findings, because the Pedrosa study was looking at knee extensions, and I don't think anyone gets like that oh shit feeling you get for a 1 rep max squat when you feel a really heavy load against your ankle for knee extensions. I don't think that's a thing.
You're not lifting the way I'm lifting.
Fair enough. But yeah, so, this is, I think, an interesting and developing area of research that, like I said, I'm not willing to put the full, like, unabashed stamp of approval on it. I'm not willing to put all of my eggs in the basket of saying it is definitely beneficial to do a combination of full and partial range of motion training versus just full range of motion training. Like, we're definitely not to that point yet. But I do find this interesting and pretty promising. One other thing to note about these studies is I'm mostly focused on the gains in full range of motion 1 rep max strength, like those outcomes. because, I mean, quite simply, I know that that's what most of the people in our audience care about. But these studies did report a variety of other benefits that also leaned in favor of doing a combination of full and partial range of motion training. So, like I mentioned with the Pedrosa study, they tested strength not just through a full range of motion, but through the bottom of the range of motion and the top of the range of motion. And the variety partial range of motion group, like doing half through the bottom, half through the top, that seemed to outperform full range of motion training through all three of those ranges of motion. In the Bazyler study, there were some measurements looking at rate of force development during isometric squats. That stuff leaned in favor of a combination of full and partial range of motion training. In the Gillingham study, again, non-significant difference for gains in full range of motion deadlift strength, but a significant difference in favor of a combination of full and partial in terms of gains in partial range of motion deadlift strength. And then for the Whaley study, they looked at jump height as well. Again, nominal difference leaning in favor of progressive range of motion training in that group or in that study. So, it seems like there's it seems like there might be just like other small upsides of doing a bit of partial range of motion training as well, beyond potential beneficial effects on full range of motion 1 rep max strength gains. So yeah, like it's interesting, but I'm not like 100% sold on it yet. That's about where I'm at. So in terms of the verdict here and my recommendations after, going through this body of research and ruminating on it a little bit, I think that there's definitely a situation where it does make a lot of sense to do some partial range of motion training for the purpose of strength development. And that is, if your weakness is through the top part of a range of motion for a particular lift, like if you miss deadlifts at lockout, if you miss bench press at lockout, probably not going to miss squats at lockout. Like it's mostly bench press and deadlift. But in that case, board press, pin press, block pulls, rack pulls might make a ton of sense to add in, independent of just like the generalized effects of combining ranges of motion. In your case, like it seems like the partial range of motion training can help correct a specific issue you have and help you develop strength through a range of motion where you're currently weak. So for if you're in that boat, seems like some partial range of motion training makes all the sense in the world. If you're not in that boat, I'm not ready to confidently say that subbing out some of your full range of motion training for partials will definitely improve strength gains. But I am bullish overall. And also like my personal experience with this is overall positive. Like I don't know that I've gotten that much out of partials for bench press, but I have gotten a lot out of partials for deadlift in particular. My deadlift was stalled in the like low 600s for a long time, and doing progressive range of motion deadlift training, just like starting at like 800 pounds for very, very partial range of motion deadlifts, like from well above knee height, and just going down like going down in rack height after I could get 5 or 10 reps. So 2-inch range of motion to start with. Once I get 10 reps there, drop it down a couple inches. Once I could get 10 reps there, drop it down a couple inches. And once I could pull 800 for like 4 or 5 reps from just below knee height, I could put the bar on the floor and deadlift over 7. Like it seemed to put about 80 pounds on my deadlift doing that. And I'll note, it only seemed to work once. I've tried that again. I didn't see the same effect, but at least through one run of partial range of motion or like progressive range of motion deadlift training, I got a ton of mileage out of it. So, my personal experience with partials, at least like partially backs up the research here. And just as a couple final notes, doing partial range of motion training at short muscle lengths, so kind of overload partials, is probably worse for hypertrophy than full range of motion training. So, if you're attempting to move up a weight class by adding more muscle to your frame, or, just trying to build more muscle, fill out your frame so you can lift more, you probably don't want to go overboard with the overload partials. And if you do sub out like a pretty significant percentage of your full range of motion training for partials, may not be a bad idea to do some targeted accessories to kind of fill that gap. So, if you were previously doing 20 sets of bench press per week and you move to doing 10 sets of full range of motion bench press and like 10 sets of, rack presses or board presses or something like that, may not be a terrible idea to add in some additional accessory exercises for your pecs and triceps to kind of make up for that difference. There's no research on that, but I think just kind of a priori, that's probably not a bad idea to make sure you're not compromising hypertrophy results. And then finally, just as a parting note, I think that there's this sense, at least in some communities, that doing any sort of overload partial is just purely ego lifting, that there's no possible beneficial effect you could get from it. So if you want to give partials a shot, maybe you do some half squats, maybe you do some block pulls, whatever. If someone tries to call you out for ego lifting, fuck them. That's kind of my perspective. And send them to this episode of the Stronger by Science podcast and
tell them to use the discount code too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's to be extremely clear, like there is some promising research in this area. It is absolutely and very much not purely ego lifting.
All right, good stuff. You ready to move on?
Yes, sir.
All right, so I've got a segment that is actually pretty short here. So a lot of times I will make a tidy list of the 27 points that I'm trying to make over the course of a segment. In this case, it's really just one pretty broad point, and we want to look at it from a few different angles. So before I get into it, Greg, a question for you. Fitness-oriented diet, we're going to really clean up the diet, pursuing some kind of body composition goal. Like, let's say maybe, going to, build some muscle, lose some body fat. Maybe you're trying to recomp. What are the two most important values that you're going to track and monitor as it pertains to your diet?
Probably total calorie intake and protein intake.
That is a very sensible answer. So obviously total calorie intake is going to have a huge impact. I mean, it's going to, determine whether or not you're in negative or positive energy balance or neutral. And it's really going to have a huge impact on how your body weight and body fat fluctuate over the course of the diet. But protein is a close second, because without question, we know that you need enough protein to support your goals, whether you're trying to build new muscle or maintain the muscle that you have during a fat loss phase. It's very uncontroversial to suggest that if you intentionally restrict your protein to very low levels, that's not going to be great for hypertrophy, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, we'll interact with folks who say, I'd like to clean up my diet a little bit, but I'm not really that interested in really meticulously watching my carb intake and my fat intake and the ratio between them. In many cases, we can just say, whatever, it's fine. Just watch your calories, watch your protein. The exact amount of carbs and fats, in most cases, not really going to matter that much. So we know that calories are absolutely crucial, but we know that protein is important too. And in the evidence-based fitness world, almost everybody recommends getting around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day of protein. A lot of people alternatively will say, well, go for like 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, which is 2.2 grams per kilogram. So there's this particular range that has gotten really, really, really popular. And the question I want to address in this segment here is, how important is it to specifically get within that precise range? Because I suspect, while I agree that is a very good range and kind of the if you know nothing about someone, you just know that muscle is important to them and they're into fitness, how much protein should they get? That is the range of numbers that I would start with in a majority of cases. But I suspect that a lot of people really dramatically overestimate the downsides and the ramifications of undershooting this target range just a little bit. We came out with macro factor over a year ago. This is a really common genre of question is, am I eating enough protein? If I go from the moderate setting to the low setting, am I losing something in that process? Protein intake comes up a lot, and it's usually coming from a place of concern about what if I don't get 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Mm-hmm. So there was a relatively new meta-analysis. I think it was published like an e-print online ahead of print a couple months ago or a few months ago, but it was by Nunes and colleagues, and the title was Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of Protein Intake to Support Muscle Mass and Function in Healthy Adults. So in terms of the purpose, a little quote here. We, the authors, performed a systematic review, meta-analysis, and meta-regression to determine if increasing daily protein ingestion contributes to gaining lean body mass, muscle strength, and physical/functional test performance in healthy subjects. So they did a really nice meta-analytic model. They did a 3-level random effects model, which properly accounts for everything that they should have been accounting for statistically. They did a very nice job with their analysis, and they were able to pool data from a total of 74 randomized controlled trials that fit their inclusion criteria. Now, I'm going to cut right to the chase here. There's a quote with the results here. The evidence suggests that increasing daily protein ingestion may enhance gains in lean body mass in studies enrolling subjects in resistance exercise. The standardized mean difference, the effect size basically, was 0.22. They concluded, yes, adding more protein, generally a positive thing for lean body mass. I'm not going to get into all the strength and physical function stuff because if your protein is making you stronger, it's probably happening via increases in muscle mass in this kind of framework, in this kind of research approach. Now that sounds like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then when you look into the table here, if you look at table 2 in the original paper, and I'll put it up on the screen here, you can see that there is, to some extent, a bit of a graded effect. So they looked at the trials with lifters where protein was under 1.2 grams per kilogram per day, and the effect size was negative 0.14. So basically indicating it wasn't statistically significant. You'd look at that and say, well, why would more protein lead, why would there be a negative effect size of lifting with, protein under 1.2? You'd still expect some relatively positive effect, but, basically when you look at the confidence interval, we can interpret that as basically zero-ish, It's not like, lifting on a low protein diet is going to induce precipitous muscle loss or anything like that. But the effect size in terms of lean body mass gains for people who were consuming less than 1.2 grams per kilogram per day of protein was negative 0.14. When they then looked at participants who were ingesting between 1.2 and 1.59, which is conveniently right below that kind of optimal range we talked about, the effect size was 0.17. So it was in the positive direction there. Just on the borderline of what we might call a trivial effect size. And then when they bumped it up to looking at studies where intake was at least 1.6 grams per kilogram per day, then the effect size bumped up to 0.3. So this is assuming, we're kind of putting these studies into bins. And of course, all these studies are going to vary across a variety of different domains and characteristics. But broadly speaking, you could look at it and say, okay, that tells us that we definitely want to have plenty of protein. And when we bump up into the higher categories, we see better outcomes for lean body mass. But there was a quote in the, in the discussion section that I think really highlights the point that I'm getting at here. So they said they were looking at that standardized mean difference, basically higher protein versus lower protein. The effect size was 0.22. And they said the change represents approximately 1.3 to 1.4 kilograms of lean mass gain during the intervention, compared to an average of about 0.8 kilogram gain in the placebo or control group. So what they were looking at here, just broadly speaking, comparing higher versus lower protein intakes, was a difference of about 0.5 to 0.7 kilograms in terms of lean body mass accretion. So they were kind of saying, like, listen, yeah, this analysis indicates that higher protein is broadly better for the accretion of lean body mass, but we're not talking about an enormous effect here. We're not talking about several additional kilograms of lean body mass within these studies. We're talking about more like a half a kilogram. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at, there's a big figure that I'm going to put on the screen here. When you start to look at the actual effect sizes in this forest plot, you kind of get a better sense of the data, where for a lot of these studies, the effect size is very comfortably straddling the line of zero. You know, when you look at the confidence intervals, a lot of these individual effect sizes are zero-ish or very near zero. So I think it's important to look at these effect sizes and really kind of chew on them and look at them and interpret them visually, so that you can see, like, when we talk about how critical high protein is, what are we really talking about here in more tangible terms? Like, not just is there an effect, but what is the size of the effect and how consistent is that effect? And so I think that figure shows it pretty nicely. If we go on, I dug into the supplementary file and found figure 12 here, which is on the screen now. It's a bubble plot, and it's basically just showing on the x-axis, what is the protein ingestion in grams per kilogram per day, and then the y-axis is just indicating the amount of increase in lean body mass that was observed. And you look at it and you can definitely say, okay, that looks like a line that's pointing upward, right? Mm-hmm. But you also see, like, if I'm looking at people who are at 3 grams per kilogram per day, I'm looking at a spread that on the y-axis ranges from a value of 1 to, maybe like negative 0.25, something like that.
Yeah.
And if I look all the way down at like 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein, I'm seeing a spread from like negative 0.5 up to like 1.7. Now, there is one that is a bit of an outlier in that regard. That's the 1.7 value is really separated from the pack. And I will acknowledge this is very much a visual segment that I'm doing here. So if you're listening along on a purely audio platform, might not be a bad idea to check out the YouTube for a little more context. But I am going to try to, verbally describe what we're seeing here. But if you exclude a couple very, very high values that are kind of just, I don't want to use the term outlier because there's some statistical connotations that I haven't rigorously checked here. But there are a couple values that are really far away from the pack. And if you exclude those, this looks like a relatively flat relationship once we're getting above like 1.3-ish, something like that. So with that in mind, I wanted to take it back to the original. So everyone always talks about this this range of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. And that range specifically, to the best of my knowledge, comes from a 2018 meta-analysis by Morton and colleagues. So they published this work. It's an excellent meta-analysis and meta-regression project by Morton and colleagues. So I don't want it to seem as if I'm being critical of this work. I'm rather highlighting this work and saying, let's dig in and kind of get some nuance from it here. So, Greg, what we're looking at here is a figure from that study. And it is the figure that you see on just about every evidence-based article about protein intake. And if you're watching along on YouTube, you can see the figure on the screen. What I did here was I used WebPlot Digitizer, which is a great tool for kind of extracting values from figures in studies. And I plotted it myself because I wanted to get rid of the lines. This is a conversation you and I have had many a time over the years. When you throw a best fit line on a regression model, it poisons your mind. Like
Yeah.
you get so fixated on the regression line. Like I could take just a random plot of totally just a plot with no relationship at all. If I just throw a regression line in there, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I see that trend. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I took all the lines out and stuff like that. Not that they're misleading. They're a good choice for the original paper. But if we just look at this distribution broadly, how would you describe it, Greg?
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, it just eyeballing it, it looks like there is maybe a very slight positive association here, but I don't know. It doesn't look like there's any like super clear discernible pattern. Like there are definitely fewer low values in the vicinity of 1.0 than there are in the vicinity of 1.75, for example. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like it's not a super clean, super strong relationship. I would say. Yeah,
and I mean, not to cherry pick, but I'll go ahead and cherry pick. But you look at this distribution and you say, well, if I was consuming 1.3 grams per kilogram per day, how certain am I that my gains will be materially different from someone who's consuming 2.1? And with it, if you start binning it up into little sections like that, you start to say, man, it's actually kind of hard to look at a particular intake and say, oh, I'm quite confident that you're going to be far worse off at 1.5 compared to 2.25. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm going to show on the screen here. It's contextualized a little bit more by adding some axis labels, just so that we can kind of get our bearings and kind of really fully contextualize what we're looking at, not just with values, but with axis labels. And then, of course, I'm going to show on the screen a linear trend line. So this linear trend line does indicate that there is, broadly speaking, a positive trajectory to this data. The R squared value for the linear trend line is 0.126. So what that tells us is protein intake in grams per kilogram per day is explaining about 12 or 13% of the variance in gains in fat-free mass. Now, one thing I should acknowledge is that the authors used a breakpoint analysis in the original paper, which means they would suggest that a linear trend is not the appropriate trend line for this. But if we look at a recreation of the original figure, this was actually taken from a Stronger by Science article. But when you add in the non-linear trend line with a breakpoint in it, you start to see where that 1.6 number comes from, right? So the in the original paper, they did this breakpoint analysis and they said, statistically speaking, our best estimate of the breakpoint here is 1.6. And the reason they're looking for a breakpoint is they're saying, how high do I have to get my protein to get to a spot where I can say this is comfortably enough to effectively maximize my gains here?
Yeah.
What they were looking at is, where does this relationship between protein and gains in fat-free mass essentially become flat? So that's what you're seeing on the screen, but the confidence interval for that breakpoint essentially spans the entirety of the data. Mm-hmm. So the statistical interpretation of this would be the breakpoint is at 1.6, but the 95% confidence interval ranges from, I forget the exact numbers, but it was basically like from 1 to like 2.2-ish or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, this was a really fantastic piece of research, and like I said, I don't want to make it seem like I'm being critical, but what I want to encourage people to do is look at these data slightly differently, okay? Because everyone sees this figure, and when you draw the trend line with the breakpoint, you say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Give me 1.6 at least. But what I want to do is kind of reframe what we're looking at here. So in the previous systematic review, I was talking about the meta-analysis by Nunes, the newer one. I mentioned that they had kind of broken it into categories. And one of their categories was, they were like, well, let's look at intakes above 1.2. That was kind of a threshold that they identified. Now, if we look at the same data, and Greg, you can follow along here, We're looking at this data and we're cutting off everything below 1.2. That starts to really change the nature of this relationship to my eye.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would agree with that. I think it still looks like there's a positive relationship there, but it does not look to be quite as a substantial upward trend.
I would definitely agree with that.
And now on the screen, we're going to look at adding in a trend line. And we're just going with a linear trend line here. And I would contend that the linear trend line is a fairly appropriate fit for this data, from my perspective.
No, yeah, I agree.
So when we look at that linear trend line and we cut out the intakes below 1.2, and that's not like arbitrary. Again, I'm trying to kind of pull that number from the Nunes review. We see that the R squared value becomes 0.044. And so what that's telling us is once we're looking at intakes above 1.2 grams per kilogram per day, protein intake is only explaining about 4%, maybe 5% of the variance in changes in fat-free mass in these studies. And there is one value in this particular data set that is kind of, it's certainly not an outlier, but it is head and shoulders above the rest. You know, there's this one value up there that's hanging out well above 3 on the y-axis that does seem to kind of nudge us towards saying, oh yeah, it looks like there's really something to these extra high protein intakes. So what I did here is I essentially just removed that one value, now we're getting into the realm of cherry picking a bit.
Well, haters might call it cherry picking, but someone else might call it a leave one out analysis.
Exactly. That is a good point, is that it's a very selective leave one out analysis. But a lot of times when someone is saying, okay, you're doing a meta-analysis, a meta-regression, are you sure that one fluky study isn't really driving the effect here? And what you'll do is a leave one out analysis where you'll go through and recalculate the whole analysis, just taking out one study at a time. So you take one study out, you leave the rest, recalculate the whole meta, and say, okay, let's try it by pulling out a different study. So the original one goes back in, you take a new one out, and you recalculate again. If that sounds awful and tedious and unbearable, by the grace of God, we have software. And so that whole process is one line of code.
Yeah.
So props to people who make software.
But yeah, and so to be clear, ultimately what you're trying to do with a leave one out analysis is you want to make sure that one particularly influential data point isn't just driving your results or having an undue amount of weight. So, if you're calculating an effect size or a beta coefficient, do you see like a 20% shift in your beta coefficient and your p-value go from like 0.04 to 0.15 if you leave one study out? Like, do you see, and this is, I think oftentimes it's somewhat subjective. Like, basically, you're just looking to see, are there any studies that are really, really influencing this pooled effect we're observing? Yeah,
and it is subjective, but you're gonna, if you're doing a leave one out analysis and there's just one particular study and all of a sudden your pooled effect size drops by 30%, you're like, oh crap, like something is really happening here.
And I'll note, just as a bit of inside baseball, I've noticed that leave one out analyses aren't done super frequently in meta-analyses, and it seems like they're almost always done when the researchers just like do their literature search, extract the data, plot it, and they're like, fuck, like I know what I'm seeing here. I know one of these studies is skewing my results, so let's say we plan to do a leave one out analysis, and then we can present the results with and without that one study.
Yeah, it's a convenient way to say, like, how can I say that one researcher is completely full of shit, but make it a systematic process?
Yeah,
essentially, yeah. Or at least get me off the hook for pretending that one particular finding is actually like representative and should be included.
Yeah.
But anyway, so if we remove that one, It doesn't really change that much, honestly. I did it because I expected that I would look at the data and say, whoa, things are fundamentally quite different here. It doesn't really change that much. And, it's on the screen. You can kind of make your own assessment there. It still looks like there's, generally speaking, an upward trajectory. But in the interest of being transparent, if I thought it was going to be nifty, I included it, even though it doesn't really fundamentally change things that much. I don't want to just only include things that I expect to be interesting that end up looking interesting.
Yeah.
So then when we look at the trend line, again, we do see that the R-squared value drops from 0.044 to 0.029. That's inconsequential. Effectively no impact there. And now I'm full-blown cherry picking. But cherry picking to prove a point. So I mentioned,
to be fair, I think that's why most people cherry pick.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not hiding the method by which I'm selecting fruit. Yeah. I am cherry picking here, but it's merely to be an illustration, which is, but I do think it's pertinent here when we're saying we're going to use this body of literature to determine the minimum protein intake that we should be not just shooting for, but stressing over.
Yeah.
So if you are going to say, here is the data set we're using to make that determination, I think you should be able to stress test it and provide various different cutoffs and say, well, how do the data look when we frame it this way?
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration. What you're doing here, I don't think either of us would argue is the best and generalizably most rigorous way to approach this. But since there is the question of magnitude and impact, if this is the type of thing that is worth stressing about, that's really, really worth getting in your head about, it should be, I would think, robust to, constraining the x-axis to an arbitrary degree and excluding one study.
Right.
If those are definitely two cherry picky type things to do, but ultimately that's not any sort of extreme data torturing. And if the previously observed relationship falls apart with that level of stress testing, that doesn't mean that the previously observed relationship doesn't exist and isn't maybe worth paying attention to, but it probably does mean that it's not a generalizably strong enough thing that you need to lose sleep over it.
Yeah, and to be very clear, I think the exclusion of one data point is a much more questionable practice than just saying, okay, if you're telling me that being below 1.6 is deleterious, I should be able to cut this x-axis at 1.3 and still see it.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm still including the cut point here.
Correct.
So I think that the x-axis modifications are fair game. The exclusion of one study, questionable, but as I've shown, I'm just reporting what I was poking around at, and it frankly didn't matter. So excluding that one study is the more questionable practice, and it's the least impactful practice of what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
So cherry picking, I'm just saying, hey, let's cut the x-axis at 1.24 and just see if we really still believe that 1.6 cutoff is a very clear, sharp delineation between suboptimal and optimal protein intake. And when we look at the figure, including that one study that's a little larger than the others, it's just not looking like there's much going on here at all. It's really difficult to say that people between 1.25 and 1.75 are worse off than people at 2.0 and above. It looks like a lot of what's going into that upward trajectory that we see in the original data set is the stuff occurring below 1.24 grams per kilogram per day. If we throw a linear trend line in there, we get an R-squared value of 0.011. So we're explaining 1% of the variance in the change in fat-free mass. If we remove that one additional data point that's a little bit larger than the rest, it doesn't really fundamentally change the visual inspection that much. But when we throw on the trend line, again, it just doesn't change that much. We've dropped from 0.01-ish to 0.003. Now, what is the point of this whole practice? It's to say, we ought to stress test that range a little bit and ask ourselves not just what is the best cutoff we can choose. Because while it's not a standard statistical practice to say, let's find the break point, forget the lower half of the confidence interval, and only look at the upper half. I have not seen that as a commonplace statistical method. But I think it's a justifiable way to view it in a practical sense. So I'm not faulting the researchers for doing that, but it is worth kind of just putting that out there. But if the claim is 1.6, you got to get there, and if not, you're going to regret it, then we should be able to cut the axis off at 1.24 and say, do we still feel that way? And when we look at this data, I think it largely conforms kind of to something that we talked about a long time ago on the show, without any data in front of us, without any kind of evidence, without a direct piece of evidence we were going by. We were talking about, like, what is the lowest protein intake that you feel generally like fine about?
Yeah.
And we didn't say the RDA of 0.8. We were both in agreement that that was pretty low. The number that we both felt pretty good about was like, get above like 1.2-ish. Looking at this data would not strictly, reinforce that number. It would say, 1.25-ish might be where you want to get above, if we're going to, assume that this data is, the best possible data that we can pull together to answer this. And I think that it is a very nice representative data set for that.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at here, I think it's important to clarify what I am concluding, but more importantly, what I'm not concluding. So I am not saying that protein is unimportant. Nothing in this presentation or in this segment would indicate that. I am not saying that protein is unrelated to gains in fat-free mass. It clearly is. I'm not saying that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram is an ineffective optimal protein target. I actually still very much believe that that is a very nice, if you were to ask me with no additional knowledge about the situation, someone's trying to build muscle, how much protein? And if you tell me to scale it by total body mass, I'm going to say 1.6 to 2.2. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that that is a bad target, but what I am concluding is a few very important points. First of all, resistance training drives muscle growth, but the protein we're adding in there is merely permissive, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. There's a lot of folks who worry way too much about their exact protein intake and not enough about, am I doing the things required to stimulate muscle growth? The training component is really driving the ship here. The protein is simply having a permissive effect. So all we're trying to do is get the protein high enough to really let those gains materialize and manifest. What I am concluding is protein restriction to very low levels is definitely bad for your gains. But clearly at really high levels of protein, it becomes a bit redundant. And even the original meta by Morton would reinforce that point with the flat relationship above 1.6. But the main point I want to make here is that there is a massive, I would say, overestimation of the cost of setting your protein target at 1.4, 1.5 grams per kilogram per day when we compare it to that optimal range of 1.6 to 2.2. There's a really pervasive misconception that the low end of that optimal range has been determined with a high level of precision, and that there is a very clear downturn in your progress if you fall just a little bit short of that.
Yeah.
When we look at this data and say, what if you get 1.3, 1.4, 1.5? The data would indicate that the difference between getting pretty damn sufficient protein intake in that 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 range, the difference between pretty damn sufficient and fully optimal is very, very slim. And the line separating those two categories is actually pretty hard to draw when you just put the data out there and say, where are we seeing the dramatic drop off in gains as protein gets lower and lower and lower? Mm-hmm. So what I would encourage people to do is be just a little bit less dogmatic about the idea that every human being that lifts should have their protein between 1.6 and 2.2. If you were to go out into like a message board or a forum, if those still exist, I don't know. You were to go into a subreddit and say, hey, I just hired a new fitness coach. I'm trying to put on some muscle. They gave me this diet recommendation, and the protein target's 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. Or for this example, 1.4. Mm-hmm. You're going to get about 2/3 of that group who says, you got to fire this person right away.
Yeah, they're a fucking fraud.
They're fully incompetent. And the other 1/3 is going to say they should be in jail.
Yeah.
Like the visceral reactions.
Well, and you might have one angry, very radicalized vegan who says like, no, abs, that's way too high. Like your kidneys are fucked.
Yeah. And before we get angry messages, I actually am vegan now. I haven't told you that yet, but
congrats.
I have made the transition. The only exception is that I haven't been eating eggs much because I don't feel like it.
Yeah.
I'm still very comfortable eating the eggs from my local animal rescue because those chickens live a better life than I do. Mm-hmm. And the reason I went vegan is just for animal welfare concerns. Yeah. So like those chickens are doing just fine.
And to be clear, that was a comment about a particular, I think, relatively small subsection of vegans, not vegans generally.
Yeah, but small subsections tend to be very outspoken.
Yes.
and that's definitely the case. But anyway, yeah, like there has been this widespread adoption of that optimal range without a lot of nuance behind it. And it has led to a lot of misinterpretations like the example I just described, which of course was hyperbolic, but I think isn't necessarily unrepresentative. And so with that in mind, I do want to talk, I want to remind people that if you're getting your protein like 1.3 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day and bumping it up to 1.6 is challenging, it's infeasible, it's inconvenient, or it's simply just unpleasant for you, it, based on the research, does not make a lot of sense to totally beat yourself up about that. I think people are really disconnected from the actual magnitude of what they might be theoretically missing out on there. And I think there are a lot of specific scenarios where I would look at someone's diet, look at their lifestyle, look at the sacrifices it would take to get them from 1.3 to 1.6 or 1.8. I would say, honestly, the juice there is not worth the squeeze. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to be losing sleep over this. And in fact, the sleep we're losing over this is probably more impactful than the protein that we're missing.
Yeah, yeah.
So with that in mind, I do want to wrap this up with some kind of practical ranges that people can lean on here. And I want to frame them based on total body mass, but also based on fat-free mass. Because one point of confusion that comes up a lot from that kind of standard optimal range is you'll find people who maybe their goal is to lose 120 pounds, right? And they're saying, I read on the internet I need to eat at least 1.6 grams per kilogram per day, but my protein intake is astronomically high.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, when we scale by total body mass alone, there are certain ranges of the body composition spectrum where this recommendation starts to really fall flat. And scaling to fat-free mass is not a perfect solution, but it is an upgrade in certain scenarios.
Yeah.
So the category that I consider pretty damn good for protein intake, the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day in the United States. I think that pretty damn good is 1.2 to 1.6. That is a protein intake where I might say, you know what? It's possible that we are not fully optimizing your gains, but we are getting the lion's share of gains that are currently accessible to you. And what gains are accessible to you, that's going to be determined by your genetics, your response to training, and the nuts and bolts of your current training program. Mm-hmm. Now, for the fat-free mass equivalent, I would say that would be roughly 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. Mm-hmm. Now, the optimal range, I still agree. I absolutely concur. If you said My goal is to leave no gains on the table, and I want to leave no doubt. I want to be certain that I am in the optimal range and I'm not under eating my protein. I still think the optimal range, going by total body mass, is 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. And if we scale that to fat-free mass, I'd say that's more in the range of like 2 to 2.75 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass. And one additional note, since you brought up vegans, this was actually already in the outline. If you are totally vegan, so no eggs, no dairy, no meat, no fish, all that stuff, and you're very adamant about supporting fat-free mass accretion or retaining it during a cut, I do think, we've talked about previously on the show, there's research indicating if you're getting 1.6 grams per kilogram per day or above per kilogram of total body mass, if you're getting into that standard optimal range, vegan diets versus omnivorous diets seem to have similar effects on hypertrophy. Even as a vegan, I can acknowledge as total protein intake starts getting lower and lower, the differences between a vegan diet and an omnivorous diet and how they support hypertrophy, the differences become more apparent.
Yeah.
And so what that means is it's very nice as a vegan to say, whatever, just eat enough protein and you're good, get over 1.6 and you're fine. If you are going to give yourself a little bit of slack and say, I don't need to push to 1.6, I realize based on the literature, I'm not necessarily losing that much if I settle a little lower than that. I would still say like either try to get like at least 1.4-ish if you're totally vegan, or just be really, really adamant about making sure that you have some really high-ish quality vegan proteins in your diet. So make sure you've got plenty of, soy-based proteins, mycoprotein-based proteins. Maybe you spend a little more time making sure that you have complementary protein sources. You just want to have a kind of a heightened sense of awareness if you're on a totally vegan diet and you are falling below that 1.6 threshold. If you're on a ovo-lacto vegetarian diet and you're still getting whey and Greek yogurt and eggs and all that stuff, you're basically an omnivore when it comes to protein quality.
Yeah.
So that little caveat there, I'd say only applies to pretty strict vegans. All right, so I think that does it. Like I said, basically just trying to make one point, and that is I'm not disputing the kind of standard optimal range for protein intake, but I do think people should, when they really hate getting up into that higher range of protein intake, it's worth readdressing the question of how much do I lose when I settle at 1.4 instead of 1.6? And the answer, based on the literature, is simply not that much.
Absolutely. I think that that's a good just kind of like generalizable thing to keep in mind. Like if someone is saying that something is good for you and you should do it and it's going to improve your gains, it is worth asking, to what extent does this seem to be generalizably true? Or, is it just like, one or two studies kind of supporting this thing? And like what is the effect magnitude? Like if something does seem to be net beneficial, but it doesn't, like the actual magnitude of the effect seems to be quite small, then it's just a question of how much is that worth it to you? Like I think this comes up in discussions of supplements pretty frequently.
Yeah.
Like, the like creatine in particular seems to be quite good. And then once you go down from there, there's a variety of things that might have a beneficial effect on strength endurance or any number of like acute training variables. Generally, the impact isn't all that large. And so if someone approached all of those things with kind of the same mindset that it seems a lot of people approach protein with, of, damn, like I definitely have to get to 1.6 grams per kilo or I'm leaving a lot on the table. I don't think most people apply that same sort of thought to supplements where it's like, well, I mean, it seems like citrulline malate has a small effect. So like I definitely need to take that before every workout. Beta alanine, it's hard to say, may have a small effect. Definitely need to take that before every workout. Like if that is the sort of reasoning process you go through, you're going to wind up being on the hook for doing all sorts of shit that may be beneficial, but probably only has a relatively small benefit. So yeah, if you don't go down that road for any number of other topics, probably not worth going down that road and getting like that obsessive when it comes to protein. And if you do find yourself going down that road on a lot of different topics pretty frequently, I would just implore you to take a step back and ask yourself, how much is this actually going to affect me? And is the cost worth the anticipated benefit?
Yeah. And, I will say it's one thing. I remember when I was younger and, especially with supplements, I intuitively understood that the effects would be small, but I had fun.
Yeah.
And I wasn't doing anything dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't taking any, dubious,
Well, you potentially were. The supplement industry back then had a pretty big issue with heavy metal contamination that we didn't find out about until after the fact.
That's true.
Yeah.
But, I was selecting...
You weren't knowingly doing anything that was risky.
I was selecting products that, if manufactured correctly, had low risk profiles,
yes,
right? So there was minimal skin in the game. It was, I'm going to have some fun and see if beta-alanine does something for me. And the cost was not super cheap for a college student, but cheap enough to swing it. So there's two different ways that people approach this. Like, are you sweating over all the small details because you're very worried and concerned? Or are you exploring the small details because you're curious and inquisitive and you enjoy that exploration process? I view those as two very, very different things. And so I try not to stifle people who want to try to mess around with some of the smaller stuff and kind of say, oh, wow, that was nice. I think I'm getting something out of it. Versus like, if you are just in a constant state of dread because you think you need to increase your protein intake by 0.3 grams per kilogram per day, you really got to revisit that.
Yeah.
And also, I just want to mention that was a really clear shot across the bow that I did receive and certainly recognize. Just unnecessarily calling out citrulline malate, which I was the first author of a meta-analysis on it, and calling out beta-alanine. I was the first author of the ISSN position stand on that. So I feel like there was clearly some jabs happening there, and I will acknowledge them, but I won't respond to them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
You can tell that
I was debating whether I also wanted to take a small shot at nitrate or caffeine versus coffee.
Yeah.
What are some other things you've looked at? Those are the four that come to mind for me.
Oh man, I mean, we did some special carbohydrate supplementation, like the high molecular weight stuff, protein stuff. Some adaptogens. Throw those in the mix. I mean, yeah, but when it comes to those papers, like you can kind of tell what got me into research and what I viewed as a fun project. It's just like, oh, I've been messing around with this stuff for 3 years. I'd like to research it.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that does it for this episode of the Stronger by Science podcast. As always, thanks so much for joining us, and we will be back soon with another episode. Thank you for listening to the Stronger by Science podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to sign up for our free newsletter to get concise breakdowns of relevant research, as well as 28 free training programs for all skill levels and all schedules. We hate spam just as much as you do, so we'll only email you when we have something really interesting to share with you. You can sign up for the free newsletter at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter, or just go to the Stronger by Science homepage and click the free programs button at the top. If you want to join in on the Stronger by Science podcast conversation, be sure to check out our Facebook group and our subreddit. The links for both are provided in the description of today's episode. Finally, please remember that we are not medical doctors or registered dietitians. So, before you make any changes to your exercise or nutrition habits, be sure to check with a qualified healthcare professional. Once again, thank you for listening, and we will be back soon with another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast.